great. Excellent. And we will send out the link to the recording, which will be placed on YouTube, to everyone who has registered for this event this evening. If you have any questions for our presenters, please go ahead and post them in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the both presentations. If you have any other questions that we don't have a chance to get to, or about something unrelated to tonight's presentations, please feel free to email us at info@anjac.org. That's info@anjac.org. And as ANJAC members, many of you are very familiar with our mission. I want to draw attention to the fact that we've updated some of the language in our mission statement as of last fall. Our first priority is to serve you as environmental commissioners, so volunteer municipal officials advising your land use boards and your elected officials on the issues that are of most importance to you and your community. And we do that by engaging in diverse and inclusive practices so that we ensure the protection of our natural resources, and we are creating equitable and healthy communities throughout New Jersey. I want to thank all of you who are ANJAC members. If you don't know if your municipality is a member of ANJAC, you can go ahead and email us at info@anjac.org, or you'll be getting a reminder soon from our staff. So you can go ahead and check out some of the benefits of membership at anjac.org/membership. You can find copies of our quarterly magazine, the ANJAC report, there as well. Because our first priority is serving you as an ANJAC member, as an environmental commissioner in your community, we want to know what is most important to you. A lot of you go ahead and reach out to us through social media, through email, find us at conferences, but we are in the process of conducting a year-long survey of you, our members. So you can go ahead and use the camera app on your phone and scan that QR code. Or look for one of several emails that you've received from us. We'll try to get the link as well in the Q&A for you to go ahead and click on that. And please let us know what is most important to you, and then we will align our programming and resources to reflect that. And stay in touch with us. So we are on Facebook and Instagram. We've got lots of programming on YouTube. Check out our website. We are working on updating that. And make sure you follow us for the most up-to-date information of what's happening, not only in Trenton, but around the state of New Jersey, as we share stories of what environmental commissioners are accomplishing. So with that, I want to say a few remarks about the work that we are doing in support of transitioning away from fossil fuels and combating climate change. We work with a lot of you on the biggies. So food waste reduction. We work on making buildings more energy efficient. We're working on greening our transportation infrastructure and expanding electric vehicle charging stations and supporting electric vehicles. And we also need to work on transitioning away from fossil fuels, looking at our energy production. And so New Jersey has done a really great job at setting a high bar for solar and wind as clean, renewable energy options. Tonight, we're talking a lot about wind energy and the research associated with it. At our next session on June 20th, we have the two wind companies coming to speak with us and give updates about their projects that are happening. We know, and we've heard from a lot of you, questions and a desire for more information about the whale strandings that have been washing up. So I'm thrilled to be able to have our guest speakers here tonight to talk a little bit about what we know and what we're finding out. What we do know, and my apologies for not having my slides with us tonight, what we do know is that in 2016, NOAA, the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, declared a UME, an unusual mortality event for the entire East Coast. So from Maine all the way down to Florida, because of an increase of marine mammals, particularly whales, washing up on our shores. The 2016 designation was the culmination of several years prior witnessing increase in marine mammal washups from Maine, again, down to Florida. So we're talking at this point in time about a decade's worth of increased strandings. What we also know in the past year is that Bunker or Menhaden are hanging out, and they hung out all winter long in the New York Bight. And so that's a prey fish for humpbacks. And so the humpbacks stayed and ate. And what we also saw was an increase of traffic into the New York, New Jersey port. The New York, New Jersey port is now the busiest port in the nation. So there have been many very unfortunate collisions between whales and ships in that area because the whales stayed longer, migration patterns are changing, we've got increased port activity. And so with climate change, we're going to continue to see more climate weirdness, more changes in migration patterns and feeding patterns. And it really underscores the importance of needing to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and transition our energy sources, as well as use less energy and green up our other systems. So with that, I want to turn it over to our speakers, because we have some really incredible professionals here with us tonight. We have Colleen Bruce from the NJDEP, so representative of the state here. She is with the Marine Resources Administration with the DEP and is a research scientist. So thank you, Colleen, for being with us tonight. And we also have Dr. Erica Stederman, who is a bioacoustician with the Center for Marine Acoustics in BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management. And so I've had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Stederman speak previously and was just blown away by the amount of information that she has in a very particular, very interesting field. So I am incredibly grateful to both of these professionals for being with us this evening. And with that, I will shush and turn over as much time as we can possibly get from you tonight. Colleen, are you starting this evening? Who's going first?
I think that Erica's going to start.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah,
all right, so I'll
me.
turn it over to you, and you should be able to share your screen.
Yeah.
All right, it's coming in.
Okay.
There we
You all
go.
can
Thank you.
See that, and you can hear me, yes?
Yes, we've got it, and we can see you and your screen.
Okay, great. Well, yes, thank you for the introduction. So my name is Erica Stederman. I am a bioacoustician. I realize that is a very unusual title. And that means that I specialize in underwater sound. So some of my previous research before I worked for the federal government was related to how fish use sound in their environment and how we can describe marine ecosystems through sound, or something we call soundscapes. But nowadays, what I do is focused a lot on cetaceans and potential impacts of underwater sound from various industrial activities out on the outer continental shelf. And so I guess before I jump into the science, I'm going to talk a lot about the sound sources specifically used in offshore wind, particularly in the site characterization phase, because that's the phase that we're at now off of New Jersey and New York waters. But before I launch into the science, I do just want to reiterate what Jennifer said about the strandings, and just acknowledge that it is a really sad thing to see these animals washing up on our beaches. Nobody likes to see it. It's really painful. It is really a shame, and that we are taking a hard look at that with our partners at NOAA. I also want to acknowledge that for a lot of tribal groups along the Atlantic coast, these whales represent really particular importance in their culture and their history. So it really is something that we can't overlook, the pain that this causes various audiences. And then I do want to just say, the reason that people like me work at places like BOEM is because we do really care, and we're trying to figure out how we can enable this, as Jennifer said, this transition to a new energy economy, but do it with the lowest impact possible. So that's why they have people like me. We have a whole team now, actually, a Center for Marine Acoustics, and there are 8 of us just within BOEM working on acoustic issues alone. And then, of course, we have many other colleagues working on other issues not related to acoustics. So that I just wanted to sort of introduce and set the stage there with that. The first thing I'm going to talk about isn't related to acoustics, but just putting everything in perspective of the process of offshore wind development. This is a pretty lengthy process. Right now, what you're seeing off of New Jersey and New York is around this stage where there are companies that are doing their site assessment, which means they're mapping the seafloor, and they're trying to figure out where the best places would be for various foundations and where the best wind resources are, and working on their construction and operations plan. That's the COP you see here. So there's a lengthy environmental review that happens after a COP is submitted to BOEM. And then once they get their approval, and only 2 projects thus far have been approved and are now at the installation phase, and those are both off of southern New England. So off of New York and New Jersey, we don't have any installation happening yet. I do have boxes around these 2 bits here. Can you all see my mouse as I'm moving it? Somebody give me a
Yes,
yes.
we
Okay.
can.
So site assessment does involve introduction of underwater sound. That is sound used deliberately for seafloor mapping, and that's what I'll focus on today. And then the installation phase, of course, introduces sound through impact pile driving. So these are the two phases that we on our acoustics team really look at the most, but it is just to set the scene of what exactly this looks like across the board for BOEM. There are quite a few phases in this process and quite a bit of environmental review that happens. Okay. And also, before I get into the science, just a little bit about sort of the policy here. So the term take, so people may have been seeing take out there in the news and reading, oh, these offshore wind projects are going to take hundreds or thousands of animals. How could this be authorized? This is wild. So I just want to reiterate that take does not necessarily mean kill. It does have kill in the definition here, but it also means to harass. And that is typically what we're looking at, especially for offshore wind related activities. The National Marine Fisheries Service is not authorizing any lethal take for offshore wind. They do sometimes authorize lethal take for things like Navy exercises and occasionally for other things that BOEM deals with, but not with offshore wind. So I just want to say that very clearly. We're not talking about that. What we are dealing with here from acoustic impacts and some others are other types of incidental take. So there are two different terms under incidental take. One is called level A, we call that level A take, and that is injury. So that could be something like a ship strike, but it also would be auditory injury. So in the context, again, that I deal with as a bioacoustician, we're talking about permanent hearing loss. So not a good thing, but not, physical injury like getting run over by a boat type of thing. Then the other type of take that we probably see in even broader scales, because it requires a lower level to get to this impact, is called level B. And this would be behavioral disturbance. So for acoustics, this would include sort of the onset of a sound that would be disturbing or cause an interruption in normal behavior up to a level that could cause temporary hearing loss. We call this TTS, just for context. This is the idea of you go to a really loud concert and you leave and your ears are ringing and you can't really hear as well for a few hours, but then the next day you're totally fine. That's what we're talking about here under level B or TTS. So for the marine mammal species that we're dealing with out there in the ocean, for level A take, for permanent threshold shift or permanent hearing loss, the thresholds are established by NMFS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and they have different thresholds depending on hearing groups or species groups, because we do know that animals like large whales hear very differently from seals or from smaller cetaceans like harbor porpoise. What's different is level B. The threshold here is 160 decibels relative to 1 micropascal. Those are acoustic units. I don't think I need to define them here, but that is a single threshold that is used for all marine mammal species, and it is a lower threshold than for level A. So anyway, I just wanted to explain that because there has been some sort of misunderstanding out in the media, especially related to all of the strandings and what is NOAA authorizing and how could this be? How could there be so many takes? So again, not lethal take, but from the acoustics realm, it could be behavioral disturbance or potentially auditory injury at much closer ranges to various sound sources. Okay, so let's talk acoustics. So this figure here is showing us on the top the general hearing range of a number of different marine species. And on the horizontal axis here along the bottom, we have frequency or pitch of a given sound. So not all animals hear in the same way, just like animals on land. Some sounds aren't even audible to certain species. For example, like an analogy on land, we can't hear dog whistles. They're just out of our hearing range, but dogs can hear them and they're quite effective. So same thing with some certain sound sources in some animals. Okay, so across the top, we have our various marine mammals, and then here we have a sort of general schematic of the frequency range of many of the sound sources that we see out in the ocean. So at the top, we generally have the loudest ones, and then on the bottom, some of the quietest ones. So what you can see here, like I just said before, is some sound sources like these high frequency multi-beam or side scan sonars wouldn't even be audible by something like a fish, right? So they're completely out of the hearing range. These vertical dashes represent pulses because they are discrete frequency bands, I should say. They're produced in very narrow beams. Some of these sounds are broader bands, so they cover a wider range of frequencies. Something like drilling noise, for example, you can see has a pretty wide spectrum of sound. So some of the most powerful sounds in the ocean are seismic air guns and Navy sonars. Neither of those are being used in the offshore wind space. So seismic air guns are used for seafloor mapping, but that's for oil and gas. And that is because they're looking for resources that are kilometers below the seafloor. So they have to use these really powerful sounds to penetrate that far. In the context of offshore wind and construction that's happening out there, they don't need to go that deep. They're only trying to image on the seafloor and, a few hundred meters below just to figure out the stability of a potential foundation. So they're using sound sources that we call high resolution geophysical sources. And those are circled in purple here, some of the most common ones. So again, these are lower in energy and they have distinct acoustic characteristics that set them apart from things like Navy sonars and air guns. And again, another misnomer we've seen in the media recently is, oh, they're using sonars out there to map the seafloor, and how loud are these things? Well, they're very different than Navy sonars. In the strict sense of the term, you could consider some of these a sonar, because that's essentially when you're producing a sound and looking for the backscatter off the seafloor. And that is, functionally, that is what a sonar is, but it's nothing like a Navy sonar. So I just want to make that very clear. I also do want to say that there's no evidence thus far that these HRG, high resolution geophysical sources, could be causing any of the mortality we've been seeing, let alone any behavioral impacts. And I'm going to be explaining that shortly. So we don't believe that they are the cause of these recent strandings. Again, still really unfortunate to see that, but there's no evidence to suggest that they could be causing such an extreme reaction or even mortality. Okay, so this is sort of the range of what we're dealing with. And I should say, other than the Navy stuff, BOEM does deal with pretty much all of these sound sources. So that's, again, why we have an entire acoustics team, because they're all different from one another. And then all the animals hear differently. So it makes our job very interesting, but also very complex. Okay, so a little more about these high resolution geophysical sources. This drawing on the right shows a couple of examples. Again, they're producing these sound beams and they're looking for the backscatter off the seafloor or objects within the water column, like fish finders or another type of, or looking for little methane seeps from the seafloor. These are typically also used by scientific agencies that deal with geophysical research. So looking for fault lines along the Earth's crust and things like that. So they all have source levels significantly lower than seismic air guns. Many of them are considered to be non-impulsive, and the word impulsive in acoustics is actually challenging to define, but essentially what I want you to remember is that an impulsive sound source is something that comes on and off really quickly. So it's short in duration, and it's considered to have very high peak pressure. So all of a sudden you go from nothing to a really rapid increase and then a really rapid decrease in pressure. That type of sound tends to be more damaging to auditory systems in animals. So seismic air guns are impulsive, and only 2 of the typical HRG sources are also considered impulsive. The rest are non-impulsive and therefore less damaging to auditory tissues. All of these sources are intermittent, which means they come on and off. They're not on continuously, unlike, the sound of a vessel or something like that. And they also have very low duty cycles. That means that they have very short periods of time with relatively long silence in between. And finally, a key point is that they're directional. And that means they're not radiating sounds in all directions equally. As you can see from the diagram, they're often radiating sounds in a narrow cone or a narrow fan-shaped beam directed down at the seafloor. And again, that's one of the reasons we call them high resolution, is because they're really focusing that sound in a really narrow area. So these are all really key factors. And BOEM as an agency, we've been seeing these sources used for decades now. They are used in the oil and gas industry, usually for different applications, not for looking for oil and gas, but for things that they do related to construction or putting down oil rigs and things like that on the seafloor. But we thought several years ago, we wanted to take a harder look at these and to really analyze them and see, well, are they impactful? Do we need to be worried about these sound sources? What do we really think the impact is? So myself and a number of co-authors, including some from the U.S. Geological Survey, started working on a paper, 3 years ago. We finally published it in 2022, and the citation is here, where we were taking a really hard look at these sources and trying to characterize them and see what we thought the potential impacts would be on marine mammals, while considering that behavioral harassment threshold I mentioned, that level B threshold of 160 dB. So we published this paper. Here's a screenshot. I have a link at the end you can all pull up. It's an open access paper. It is very technical and takes some effort to get through. I'm proud of it, but it's not the easiest paper to read, I admit. So what we did is we actually made a video to complement the paper, and I'm now going to play that video. And honestly, it does a lot of the work for me of explaining something that's a pretty technical bit of material to get through. So I'm going to go ahead and play that now, and hopefully this works. Somebody please chime in if it doesn't.
People use underwater sound as a tool for exploring the ocean, such as mapping geological features on and beneath the sea floor, measuring the number of fish, and finding appropriate places for the construction of wind turbines. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, analyzes these sounds to determine how and where they should be used in order to avoid harassment of marine species. Two U.S. laws, the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, require specific protocols to avoid or minimize harassment of marine animals. Regulatory agencies provide guidance on acoustic limits. If the sound level is above the threshold when it reaches an animal, it may result in behavioral harassment of that individual. If an animal is exposed to a sound below the limit, it would not be considered harassed. We classify these sound sources as de minimis, meaning they have minimal impact on marine species. These thresholds are useful, but they only focus on how loud the sound is and do not include other important characteristics of the sound source. A recent study completed by BOEM and the USGS closely examined high-resolution geophysical sources that are typically used to map the seafloor. The study characterized and classified a suite of sound sources based on their potential to affect marine species. The first characteristic was the frequency or pitch of the sound. Some resources transmit sounds that are above the hearing range of most marine mammals and are considered de minimis simply because the animals cannot hear them. The second factor is the amplitude, or how loud the sound is when it reaches an animal. Normally, the amplitude is defined as the source level from the device generating the sound, but sounds lose energy with distance, so by the time they reach an animal, the received level could be below the threshold, meaning the source is not impactful. Also, it's unlikely that a marine mammal will encounter an area where sound levels are high or significantly disturbing. Even in areas with very high densities of marine mammals, calculations show that a single individual would rarely receive high sound levels. This indicates that some louder sounds may be considered de minimis under most conditions. The width of the sound beam is also an important consideration in determining the impact of sound sources. Omnidirectional sources radiate sound energy equally in all directions, but many high-resolution geophysical sources have sound beams that are more narrow and only insonify a small part of the water column. Therefore, some acoustic sources can be considered de minimis because they only insonify a small volume of water, and thus are unlikely to be encountered by a marine mammal. Finally, it's important to consider the total duration of a sound source as it passes by an animal. Many high-resolution geophysical sources emit very short pulses of sounds. The number of pulses relative to the animal's position and the speed of survey vessels are used to determine the total duration of sound that an animal may encounter. Most animals will receive such a short total duration of sound that it can be considered de minimis, especially compared to all of the various sources they hear in a typical day. By evaluating these characteristics of active acoustic sources, most high-resolution geophysical sources, such as those used for surveying areas for renewable energy or sand resources, can be considered de minimis and are unlikely to result in harm to marine mammals. The findings of this research help agencies to determine which sources require regulatory review and mitigation, such as protected species observers to operate safely around marine species, and which sources do not. This provides us with a more complete understanding so that BOEM can confidently deploy high-resolution geophysical systems in support of the agency's mission to manage development of energy and mineral resources in an environmentally and economically responsible way. To learn more, visit boem.gov.
Oopsie. Okay, so that summarizes the paper. Our main findings of the paper led us to putting sounds into 4 different tiers. In the paper, we did include air guns, so I'm not going to talk about those further, but essentially those would be considered tier 1 and tier 2, which means they could result in behavioral harassment for sure, and we absolutely think they require mitigation. What was interesting is that we found most of these HRG sources could be considered de minimis, which means we don't think they would result in behavioral harassment, even without any mitigation that would need to be applied, because of those factors that the video explains, that we think they can be considered de minimis. There are a handful of sources that are still being used that we think could be considered de minimis if mitigations are applied, meaning that there would be observers out there and they would shut down if an animal comes within a certain distance of the source. And of course, any new sources that we haven't been able to analyze fully should remain in tier 3. So this was the main finding of the paper. And so our suggestion was that we actually don't even need mitigation for a lot of these tier 4 sources. But I do want to mention that for now, even though that was in the paper, for now, the status quo is that BOEM is requiring mitigation for both tier 3 and tier 4 sources. So all of the site characterization surveys going on in the Atlantic right now, using any of tier 3 or tier 4 sources, do have marine mammal observers out there. They are required to shut down if they encounter an animal, and they are required to report any encounter with a whale, even if the source wasn't operating. So that's another reason why we're quite confident that none of the vessels related to HRG surveys could have been implicated in any of the vessel strike fatalities we've seen, because they are required to report anything that happens. So this is the takeaway from the paper. Just getting to conclusions on this part, and then I have a couple more slides after that. We believe that the current mitigations being used for site characterization are more than adequate. There's no evidence that the site characterization work could be the cause of the whale strandings. And just for context, none of the surveys have even sought level A harassment authority from National Marine Fisheries Service, and actually very little level B authorization either. They don't believe that they're going to result in behavioral harassment either. So to me, this sort of closes the book on these particular sound sources. Of course, there's still a big open question about what is the cause of a lot of these mortalities. And I do just want to direct you to the National Marine Fisheries Service website. They do have more information about the ongoing UMEs that have been happening. Some of them are, a decade or more old. So I do encourage you to look there, and any questions related to those details should be directed at them. I'm definitely not a marine mammal strandings expert, that's for sure. So, all right, if we think that these site characterization surveys aren't really a big concern, then what is BOEM focusing on? Like I said, we have this whole acoustic center and we still have plenty to do. So we have a couple of things that I want to bring up here. Related to impact pile driving, which is a very loud sound source and could have significant impacts. We are really focusing on that and trying to establish a sound level limit, essentially, a sound level that the companies cannot exceed, or else they wouldn't be authorized. We have seen in German waters, they established a sound level limit more than a decade ago. And what that did is it pushed industry to innovate, and they came up with things they call bubble curtains and a number of other noise abatement methods, where they essentially try to remove acoustic energy from the water column. So the pile driving does create acoustic energy, just it happens to do that. It's really a byproduct of just the motion and the physics of that. But there are certain ways that you can try to minimize that through noise abatement methods. And I want to show you an example here on the right-hand side. This is a figure showing noise reduction from different types of noise mitigation or noise abatement methods. So all of the different colored lines, this is a big bubble curtain, double big bubble curtain, hydro sound damper, etc. These are all words describing these noise abatement methods. The vertical axis starts at 0 and goes into negative numbers. And that's because we're looking at how much noise reduction from an unmitigated pile you could get. And then on the frequency axis here, you can see we go from 16 hertz up to 16 kilohertz. So the reason I show this is because what you can see is that there's a pretty significant drop. You get a huge noise reduction from a lot of these different methods, but that kind of starts around 500 hertz. Below 500 hertz, unfortunately, a lot of these noise abatement methods don't work as well. And that's a problem in the US waters because we have these large baleen whales that hear best in these low frequencies. So in the North Sea and other parts of Europe, their main concern is harbor porpoise, and they've done a great job setting a sound level limit and getting noise reduction in the frequency range that harbor porpoise can hear. But we are the first country now dealing with a low frequency cetacean that is overlapping with offshore wind. And so we really need to get our heads around what can we do to reduce acoustic energy in these low frequencies. So what BOEM is doing is we're putting out a received sound level limit that would go into place in 2026. And that means any project doing pile driving from then onward would not be able to exceed that limit. And we're focusing that limit on those low frequencies specifically. We're also in conversations with the regulator in Australia for what it's worth. They have a similar problem because they have low frequency cetaceans and they're just beginning the offshore wind process there. And they have a highly endangered baleen whales that live exactly in the corridor where their offshore wind is being planned. So they're looking at us to set the example for how do countries who deal with low frequency cetaceans authorize offshore wind with impact pile driving? Well, we're pushing industry to innovate. So we are really hoping that establishing this limit will do that for us. And of course, with any limit you establish, you need to be able to enforce it. So this requires sound measurements from every pile that's being installed. So those two things go hand in hand. Another thing that we're trying to do a bit more of is looking at vessel quieting. BOEM doesn't have authority over many of the vessels out on the water, but we do have authority over the vessels related to offshore wind or any offshore activity for energy development. So we are trying to see what we can do. The International Maritime Organization is about to release some new vessel quieting guidelines. So we're really trying to make sure that those are included in the offshore wind vessels moving forward. So those are some of the ways we're looking at mitigating. Then thinking about monitoring. So there will be monitoring during pile driving to look for whales during construction. I would actually consider that a mitigation method. What I talk about here is looking at the big picture of what might happen to these baleen whales that live on the East Coast once offshore wind is up and running. So not necessarily during the construction phase, but rather just with the presence of all these turbines. Are they going to continue using these habitats? Are they going to avoid them? Or is it going to stay the same? How does this compare to all of the other existing stressors that are going on out there? So we're trying to get our heads around this question, and we're focused on using passive acoustic monitoring as a method to study baleen whales. They vocalize and you can track them based on how frequently and where they're showing up and they're making their calls. So we're working with a lot of partners, including Colleen here on the call, to stand up a multi-year regional monitoring program where we would be working with a number of stakeholders to put instruments out there and study this over these large spatial and temporal scales. One other piece of that actually really excites me based on my background is the concept of acoustic succession, so to speak. So we're expecting that these wind farms are going to provide habitat for many fish and invertebrates that are going to settle there. Many of them produce sound. They're soniferous, we say. We will probably be able to track that by having passive acoustic monitoring stations or hydrophones out there from, construction onwards. We will be able to see the time point at which these animals start to occupy the space and, in a way track acoustic biodiversity with actual biodiversity. So I think that's really an exciting area where we could see some of the positive benefits of offshore wind. And then finally, study. So there's still a lot of knowledge gaps in our field. And I just want to note that BOEM does have an environmental studies program where we fund applied research every year. This is the link to our website. And there are a couple, well, I just threw a couple up here, but we have so many topics we'd like to pursue and fund. Some of them relate to different types of pile driving, impact versus vibratory piling, impacts of substrate vibration on the critters that live on and in the seafloor. So those would be benthic fish and invertebrates. And then other things like auditory recovery time. So how do marine mammal auditory systems recover in between the strikes from impulsive pile driving, for example? So these are just a couple. We have a whole bunch of information and dreams of how to fund future research. There's a lot of questions still. So with that, I just want to show a screenshot of a couple things. This is our paper, and it is open access. You can also email me for a copy. On the right-hand side, I just want to draw your attention to a document we completed recently. We call our sound source list, which is basically an encyclopedia type level of information about all of the sound sources that BOEM deals with. So not just offshore wind, but oil and gas and others as well, to describe the sources. So it's a less technical than the paper on the left, but it does explain kind of the typical use case, typical frequency range, and things like that. So that's available as well. If anybody would like a copy, you are most welcome to email me, and I'll just leave my email up there for a moment and draw your attention to our Center for Marine Acoustics website if you'd like to learn more about the work we're doing. And that's it for me. So thanks for your time and attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Satterman. That was wonderful. If you could stop sharing your screen now.
Yep.
One of the things that really intrigues me and that I'm fascinated by are the bubble nets. Or the bubble curtains, because as I understand it, that stems from us learning from a technique that some humpback whales use to hunt. So they create these bubble curtains, which then can stun their prey and drive them to the surface, and then they feed on it. So it's a partnership, a collective feeding that we've actually observed multiple females using in Australia and the New Zealand waters. So I've got family in Australia, so I pay attention to what's going down there as well. My mom, my sister, my niece are all down there. And so us learning from them to provide ways to protect them is something that I think is just a really beautiful and intriguing story and makes me want to learn more. So thanks for sharing that. We do have some questions, but we're going to hold those to the end at this point. I want to thank you, and I want to also invite Colleen Bruce to go ahead and share her video and to turn over the screen to her to present. So thank you, Colleen, for being with us as a representative of the DEP tonight from the Marine Resources and Offshore Wind Development Division. And we're interested in hearing about research and what the state of New Jersey is doing with regard to offshore wind. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Jen. How does my video look? Can you see
It
my
looks
slide?
great. Yep, we've got your screen and we can hear your audio. So we're
Great,
all good to
thanks.
go.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here and listening to what I have to tell you tonight. This is you know, my job kind of starts to take over my life sometimes, because like what Dr. Statterman says, we all care so much, and we're thrilled to be able to do the work that we do. So my name is Colleen Bruce. I work for the Department of Environmental Protection here in New Jersey, and I'm in the Marine Resources Administration. So we are the group that protects and manages our fish, our benthic habitats, our fisheries, our marine mammals, our turtles. Everything under the water is kind of within our jurisdiction. And I lead the Marine Resources team that was put together just to work on offshore wind. And that team has changed a little bit over time. We add people, and we've consulted with somewhere around 14 of our biologists and scientists over the last 4 to 5 years as we've been working on offshore wind. And our job is to understand the risks associated with marine resources and offshore wind so that we can provide the best advice to our administration to minimize those risks. So I think I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about the development of offshore wind in New Jersey, and then I'll talk to you about the decision making that we do, how to focus on marine resources and specific effects. And then that will lead us to the research that we are now funding to provide the most important information about minimizing impacts from offshore wind. So as Jen alluded to, we have the largest goal for offshore wind on the East Coast at this time. That's 11 megawatts of offshore wind power by the year 2040. We have 3 projects in development right now: Ocean Wind 1, Ocean Wind 2, and Atlantic Shores. And those came from 2 power purchase agreements that we call solicitations. And we have a 3rd solicitation that's open right now. And part of that 3rd solicitation was a pretty extensive list of environmental and fisheries protection targets that developers must meet to qualify to enter a power purchase agreement with our state. And you can see those leases off our coast here in this map on the right side. And citing those leases was informed by a lot of work, including a study that the Department of Environmental Protection conducted in 2007 called the Ecological Baseline Study that identified areas off our coast with you could look at it 2 ways: either the highest risks, the areas you would want to avoid because of potential impacts with resources, or potential sites for offshore wind. But that said, we have a very busy continental shelf with lots of users: the Department of Defense, lots of shipping, as Dr. Statterman talked about, We have active and very valuable marine fisheries here in New Jersey. We have very active recreational fishing. So a lot of folks out there relying on our marine resources. And essentially our goal is to assist in developing offshore wind projects while minimizing any potential impacts. And to be able to do that, the first thing we needed to understand was what are the resources that we steward that are within the project area. And to do that, we looked at that baseline study. We looked at our high value marine habitats. Some of those are identified in our coastal zone management rules, like SAV beds, prime fishing areas, surf clam habitat. If you've never used the Mid-Atlantic Data Portal, highly recommend it. It's both fun and really educational, and you can use it to build maps that show marine resources alongside wind energy areas. We looked at our federally and state managed fisheries. We did an extensive literature review, and we talked a lot to our stakeholders. So once we understood the resources in the project areas, we needed to understand better what are the potential impacts from offshore wind on those resources. And that starts with really what are the effects of offshore wind. So effects are the physical and chemical things that are kind of inherent to offshore wind development, like noise, as Dr. Staderman was talking about. So we built a library using peer-reviewed publications and gray literature. So those would be reports coming from existing wind farms. There's a small one off the coast of Rhode Island, and BOEM has done a series of environmental studies to understand what's going on post-construction at that wind farm. And there have been wind farms in Europe for more than 25 years. So lots of great research available to understand offshore wind and potential impacts. We attend scientific meetings, and there are some really great sources that are focused on peer-reviewed literature related to offshore wind and resources, like the TETHIS database. So we use those two kind of chunks of information to identify what we call our resources of concern, or which resources do we steward that may be most vulnerable to offshore wind effects. So those would be resources that are threatened, endangered, or protected, like our marine mammals. Resources that are sensitive to a particular effect, for example, our surf clam fishery. Those fishing trips require a large area for the vessels to operate, and they have mobile bottom gear that really is not suited to fishing between turbines. So that fishery would be sensitive to that effect of the presence of those turbines. We looked at habitats that are likely to be significantly altered, and then we looked at high value species in terms of both ecological value and economic value, and also high value habitats and high value fisheries. And the next question for us was, well, what don't we know yet? What do we need to know to be able to make the best decisions within our organization? So what are the most critical information gaps that we could potentially fill? And some of the same sources that I mentioned before, literature review, scientific meetings. We're very active in other regional groups that were put together just to coordinate offshore wind research related to wildlife and fisheries. And there are quite a few of those, including the Regional Wildlife Science Consortium and the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. And we've done a lot of stakeholdering. We have a stakeholdering group for the state called the Environmental Resources Working Group. So now we kind of have a more specific list of what our concerns might be and what information is missing. And that was really the foundation for our goals for research and monitoring. And what we would like to do with any research money we have is conduct highly rigorous research that is hypothesis driven, that can improve our understanding of populations and ecosystems, and our ability to detect and manage any potential, detect and measure any potential impact, with the goal of minimizing impacts. So the research that we're looking at is essentially to identify impacts if they occur, quantify those impacts if they occur, and in some cases replace data that may be lost by existing and long-running research surveys that could be impacted by offshore wind. So once those turbines are in place out there, it may be difficult for both the state of New Jersey and NOAA to get their long-running trawl surveys into the wind energy areas. So we would like to find a way to mitigate for any impacts to those surveys as well. So the New Jersey Research and Monitoring Initiative is a new regional research program that was developed to both detect and mitigate any potential impacts of offshore wind on our wildlife and fisheries. And this was funded by our second solicitation for offshore wind, and it provided $10,000 per megawatt just for research and monitoring on offshore wind and fisheries. And we modeled this after the requirements of the New York solicitation. So we not only work closely with other regional groups, but other states as well, and we can learn from each other. So we developed research priorities based on those information gaps, and we're currently developing both research projects to address them and also requests for proposals to kind of solicit research proposals from the scientific community. And we're funding those projects both through contracts with state universities and Sea Grant Consortium universities, and also through the RFPs that I mentioned. So here's a snapshot of our initial research priorities that we with our own environmental resources and working group, but also other regional organizations. And these are kind of broken down into major resource groups. So we have birds and bats, we have fish, turtles, we have our fisheries. And then within those categories, we looked at what do we most need to know about each of those topics. And from those priorities, we started developing projects. And this was our very first project. And I kind of consider it my baby because surf clam is one of those fisheries that we do think is most likely to be impacted. And because of that, a couple of years ago, we started a monthly research meeting specifically for offshore wind and surf clam. And part of that meeting is talking about what are the information gaps and how can we address them. And the attendees include academics who are experts in the field, NOAA fisheries, and the industry itself, because they're sometimes the best source of information about what that industry needs to continue to be successful. So this project is really a mitigation project because it helped develop a new survey methodology that would be able to be used post-construction. Currently,
Colleen, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure we've had some chat going on in the Q&A about your slides. Oops,
I'm so sorry. Oh, gee, I wish you'd mentioned that. Thank you. Apologies.
So, yep, great. Thank you.
That should be much
Maybe
better.
we could go back and just take a quick look at them if you wouldn't mind.
Of course. I'm so sorry.
There we go.
These are our offshore wind projects off of the coast and right here in this area, right off our shores. And here we have the New York Bight leases. This is where I was kind of going through what resources are in our project areas. What are the effects of offshore wind that we should be concerned about? Which of our resources might be most vulnerable to wind? Those are the ones we want to focus on. And what are our information gaps? And here is a list of our research priorities. So there. That gets us back to where we were. I apologize. So the Surf Clam project was to construct a new dredge that was smaller than the other survey dredges, so it could be used in the project area, and to do a calibration experiment. So to understand really well how that dredge works and how data coming from the dredge could be compared to other surveys that have been going on for a long time. And that project's being done by Rutgers University, by Daphne Monroe, and in close association with the surf clam industry. And they're also collecting some environmental variables related to climate change, ocean acidification, and response of the clam shells to some indicators for ocean acidification. The second study we launched was related to how recreational fishing might be impacted by offshore wind, and that's being conducted by Pankaj Lal with the Clean Energy and Sustainability Analytics Center at Montclair University. So that's going to provide some background information about our recreational fishery to inform how development of offshore wind might affect both that recreational fishery and also our very important tourism industry here in New Jersey. The next two slides are about research that's being conducted by Monmouth University and the team there. And this first one, if you take a look at the map on the left and look for these red dots, those are acoustic receivers that are used to identify tagged fish. So we're setting up this huge network of acoustic receivers off our coast and also tagging a lot of recreationally, ecologically, and commercially important fish species so that we can follow how those fish are moving and migrating across our coast now, so that we can then understand how that might change during and post-construction. And alongside that study is an environmental DNA study by the same researchers. And this will collect 1 liter water samples from a number of locations off our coast alongside some long-running surveys. And the purpose of that is to inform whether environmental DNA can be a valuable survey technique moving forward. It's non-extractive, so it doesn't require killing any fish. It's less expensive and it can be done post-construction. But by collecting these data pre and post-construction, we hope to be able to detect any impacts in fish communities if they occur. Birds and bats are one of our important resources. So we currently have a request for proposals open to increase the MODIS network. This is another type of receiver that detects tagged birds and bats as they move past these, the towers onshore and the buoys offshore. The Are You Cool team at Rutgers University is doing a few studies for us. And one of those is to look at what potential the wind farm itself has to be a long-term environmental monitoring platform. So they're looking what kind of machinery can be attached to those turbine foundations to provide environmental data moving forward. So at first they advised us on what we should include in our third solicitation to request from developers. And the second part of that study is to provide more information about the best type of equipment to be mounted on turbines. Some of that same group is also working on a glider study for us that is actually already launched. Gliders are automated remote underwater vehicles that collect data at sea using very little power. And the data they're collecting is related to both environmental conditions, things like temperature, salinity, density, pH, but also there's equipment on those gliders that can do active acoustics for fish. So they send out a sound signal and they listen for a response from things like schools of fish and zooplankton. They also have passive acoustics on them. So these are devices that listen for any animals that are in the environment that are vocalizing, like Dr. Statterman talked about. And they also have receivers for tagged fish. So these are really decked out, and they'll be doing 4 transits of the coastline back and forth every year for at least 2 years, and that's just pre-construction. And of course, we hope to extend all of these studies during and post-construction. So you may be getting the sense that we're looking for a lot of baseline information off our coast. And I think it's been a little surprising to lots of us who work on offshore wind how much we still need to know about our resources off the coast. And offshore wind's actually been a really wonderful opportunity for us to learn more about those resources. We are working with Stockton University on a study on harbor seal satellite tagging. So the team there at Stockton has been studying the largest group of seals that overwinter in New Jersey, and they're right here in Great Bay. So they'll be both putting tags on those seals so that they can study how they're moving offshore, with the potential to be able to understand changes in those movements and behaviors post-construction. But while they've got the seals kind of in hand to put the tags on, they're also collecting lots of biological data about them and doing a health assessment. So that kind of leads us to research about wind in whales. And we've been tracking kind of the state of the science on wind in whales for quite some time. And one of the latest publications to come out was a study that Dr. Statterman worked on that provides information about how to do passive acoustic monitoring on whales. So these are, as Dr. Statterman described, they're receivers that are under the water or potentially attached to a glider or on a buoy or dragged by a boat, and they listen for whales that are vocalizing. And this publication was a long time coming, and was the result of a number of workshops that were aimed at putting the best scientific minds in the same place to really make the best recommendations on how to do this kind of research, because it really is considered one of the best ways to understand the baseline condition of how whales are moving and using the habitats off our coast. And that's exactly the kind of technology that it's on our gliders. And we have funded a similar study that is doing real-time passive acoustic monitoring for whales on a receiver off our coast. And that's being conducted by Mark Baumgartner at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And this will not only collect information about whales over time, but it provides pretty rapid feedback to the shore when there's a whale nearby. So this could potentially be used down the road to signal vessels that there are whales nearby, time to slow down. And that's not quite happening yet, but it is informing the locations and the seasons for slow zones to slow boats down when there are whales around. We have open right now a request for proposals to construct a passive acoustic monitoring network off of our coast. And this grid was recommended by the research paper that I mentioned a minute ago. And we hope to be able to put at least 10 to 12 of those receivers off our coast, possibly in 2 lines like you see here in these green lines, so that as whales move up and down our coast, they can be detected by these receivers. And again, we want information pre-construction and post-construction so that we can determine whether any impacts have occurred. So that's kind of our research in a nutshell. We try to keep our initiative responsive to new research that's coming out and make our research priorities adaptive. And we recently had a call for comments on adapting our priorities. So that's in progress right now. So our priorities might vary a little once we have research projects to address them, or we determine that perhaps the impact is much less likely than we thought it would be. That hasn't happened yet, but we're keeping these adaptive to new research as it comes out. And if you'd like to know more about the DEP and offshore wind, you can use this QR code right here, and you can also follow that to find out more about the research that we are funding. And feel free to contact me anytime at my email. So thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Colleen. I appreciate that. All great information, and we look forward to hopefully having you and your colleagues back in the future as this research continues to develop. So we have a few great questions. If we could get Dr. Satterman to turn her video back on, I'll run through a few of them, and we will wrap up by 8:15 at the latest to try to return some of this evening back to you. We've got a question from an ANJAC board member. Lee asks, why does it take until 2026 to start the noise mitigation? I think this is directed at you, Dr. Satterman, and we're speaking about the low frequency noise mitigation specifically related to the pile driving, not all noise mitigation.
Yeah, and I'm
Correct.
sorry, I understand the confusion in the way I explained that. So the status quo right now for projects that are starting construction already and being authorized is that they are definitely required to use noise abatement methods. In fact, in US waters, I don't think we're going to see any piles being driven with no mitigation methods at all, just because of the animals we have here. What I meant was that specific new received sound level limit, which is an actual number we're putting out there, because the way that it's baked in now is kind of weird, and this is why we want to switch it. Right now it says you need to put a bubble curtain or 2 bubble curtains on and reduce your sounds from an unmitigated source level by 10 to 20 decibels. So it's taking some unknown unmitigated level and just subtracting a certain amount. The problem is the piles are getting bigger over as time goes on, and we don't want that to just keep going up and scaling. So we're trying to say, no, you cannot exceed this number. And that number is the level for auditory injury for low frequency cetaceans at 1 kilometer distance. That's what we think is a reasonable number to say. You can't go beyond that. So that's the part, that set number is the part that doesn't go into effect till later. The reason we need to give it such a lead time is because we think this is a fairly aggressive target, and industry is going to take some time to need to innovate and figure out how to get their heads around this. It's definitely more aggressive than what they're seeing right now. So we've already signaled to them that it's coming. We co-hosted a workshop with the Department of Energy in December. We're starting to roll it into our environmental documents to signal, hey, this is coming. But we do need to give a bit of a grace period for those companies to get ready for this, because this will require potentially completely new methods nobody's thought of, or a lot of bubble curtains, or hopefully something else that's more effective in those low frequencies. Hopefully that answered it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that was really helpful. And one more question, we'll stick with pile driving. I think I know the answer to this, but do sound level limits for pile driving exist for the oil and gas industry? So are we just talking about a difference of industries and standards, or is it all together? We don't have a lot of oil and gas off of the East Coast, really more,
Right.
you know, Florida has some in the Gulf, but
Yeah, there's none on the Atlantic coast that I'm aware of, at least not in BOEM's waters, which are federal. So actually the answer is no. The oil and gas industry has gone not completely unregulated. I mean, they have marine mammal observers and shutdowns required during seismic surveying and all those things, but they don't have a received sound level limit like what we're pushing for offshore wind. And we're going to take a look at that next, actually, because right now there's so much momentum and effort and things happening really quickly with offshore wind. But it's been years, decades that the oil and gas industry has been using seismic air guns in the Gulf, and they've been able to do things that nowadays, I think, because the science has finally caught up to suggest that these things are impactful and they probably shouldn't be emitting so much sound. So it's, you know, kind of that started before the science had really started, and now it's caught up and we're recognizing, wow, this is a really big issue. So the long and short answer is they don't have a received sound level limit like what we're describing here. They do have mitigations they're required to do to protect marine mammals when they're in the vicinity. And that's, yeah, the shortest answer I can give right now.
great. Thanks for clarifying that. We have a question that I think could be for either Colleen or for you, Dr. Satterman. Is there research which indicates the marine characterization surveys are safe for the endangered whales and other cetaceans and marine mammals? So I know science is such that, you know, proving something is safe is often a difficult challenge. But if you have any insight on that, we would welcome it.
Well, yeah, I would point to our paper, the paper. I don't know if that person listening saw the earlier part of my presentation, and I could certainly put in the link in the chat, but that paper is focused on the physics of the sources themselves. And even without including aspects of biology, really like things about how animal recovery time in between hearing certain sound pulses or aversion, like animals generally react to boats and they tend to swim away before they are even close enough to these sound sources to be impactful. So that is probably the best study we currently have right now out there. And it does focus on that 160 dB threshold for behavioral harassment for marine mammals. So we believe that based on the characteristics of the sources, that they wouldn't result in behavioral harassment, let alone TTS or PTS. Those would have to be much louder sources to induce those kind of things. So yeah, I'd encourage them to look at the paper. I think that's the best thing we have right now.
And we'll follow up and get a link to that paper. Thank you for making it open source, because it's often difficult to access scientific information because it's locked away behind paywalls. And when we send out the link to this recording, with your permission, we'll include a link to that article as well. Sure. Wonderful. Next question. This is a great one. Is there a reason why LBI, Long Beach Island Wind Project, is so close to shore as compared to some of the other projects? It seems further offshore would be preferred. And I can jump in here from having reviewed a number of iterations of these projects over years. And I encourage everyone here to come to our next session on June 20th and hear from the wind developers themselves. But the closest wind turbines that are planned for the Jersey coast are 14 miles out. So I know there have been some images that have been floating around social media that show them not 14 miles out. They look really close. I will say those images are taken from somewhere else or doctored. On the best, clearest day with low mist in the right angle, you may be able to see some of these wind turbines. Again, 14 miles out is pretty far from a human visual sight point. It's not impossible, but it is pretty far. And there are many others that are 19 miles out, and there are some proposals that are floating around for the, we're at the third bid right now that you would not be able to see because they're 40 plus miles out. So the closest is 14 miles. I don't know, Colleen, as working specifically in New Jersey, if you want to share something about that, or if that covers it.
No, I think you did very well. Thank you, Jen.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next, we have Dan Bachalis asks, and I might step in on this one as well. Have any of the politicians, especially those who oppose offshore wind development, contacted any of you about the science behind all this? So I won't answer that question. I will say that there was a legislative hearing, I believe it was week before last, could have been last week, and in the Assembly, that brought in the DEP commissioner, the Marine Mammal Stranding Center, which I encourage you all to go and take a look at the Marine Mammal Stranding Center. They've been doing amazing, really, really hard work with the whale and dolphin wash-ups. They're a wonderful organization that provides rescues to seals, harbor seals that are in New Jersey all year round. And so they've got some great data. And so they were contacted, the DEP and the Marine Mammal Stranding Center, and Rutgers came and gave testimony. Before that, there were some other hearings where there were really primarily fossil fuel advocates that provided testimony, and ANJAC did not participate in those. I did attend the most recent one where there were scientists providing testimony. So I'll turn that over to you, Colleen and Dr. Satterman.
The short answer is no. But as you said, it's certainly been addressed both in the New Jersey Senate and the Assembly.
And my short answer is maybe not quite the right people, but we did, BOEM and NOAA did do a briefing for congressional staffers like February. It's been quite some months now after the first sort of round of stranding started to happen. So we did answer some questions then, and there have been a few follow-ups in writing, but I don't think I could say specifically any of those who have opposed offshore wind reaching out to us directly, no.
Great, thank you. we've got a couple questions about what would you say to someone who said we should have had all this data, or we should have more data before developing offshore wind? Or when will more studies be available? When will we know more? So Colleen, you talked a little bit about some ongoing research. Dr. Satterman, you did as well. So I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to offer for those type of questions we have.
Well, I would just say, and I'm a teacher at Stockton as well. And what I tell my students is science is a process, and it continues to be done, so we can always learn more. But there is extensive work that's been done both in Europe on the offshore wind farms there, and of course conditions here are different, and there's been a lot of work done on the Block Island wind farm, but of course our conditions are different here. So there's really we can't recreate a wind farm off our coast, an imaginary wind farm, and understand everything there is about it. So that's why New Jersey is really committed to continuing to do research for the entire life of the projects, not just now, not just pre-construction, but during construction, all the way through decommissioning, to ensure that we understand exactly what's going on with our marine resources in response to offshore wind.
You said it really well, Colleen. Yep, a lot of lessons learned from Europe, but then some lessons you can't really learn until you're really here in the actual environment. So we will be monitoring the heck out of this as we go along, for sure. And the first two, Vineyard Wind and South Fork, that are beginning construction this summer, there is a lot of monitoring happening around there for sure.
Right. And so we'll have one more question to close it out from your perspective. And so I'll ask each of you to answer this. From your perspectives and research, are industries becoming more responsive to scientific discoveries and more cooperative with conservation, and I would add regulatory efforts?
I'm just going to go first again. I hope you don't mind, Erica. They're required to be. They're required to be by the federal review process and by the state review process. And in addition to the research that they are funding through the state, through the RMI, each project is doing their own research and monitoring specific to that project, both related to fish and fisheries, the benthic environment. So yes, they've been responsive in my experience, and also they are required to be by law.
Yep, same here. I would say I think they're quite proactive and really trying to get ahead of the issues as best they can, and going above and beyond in some cases from what they're being required to do. And the collaborative nature has been really great to see. We have a group that is a sort of a coalition of state, local, federal, industry, NGO caucuses, and are all coming together to share data and think about science strategies and things like that. They're called the RWSC, Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, for those who haven't heard of them. And so the industry is really showing up in that realm, and has been a really active player. So yes.
Great, thank you. Well, we are at time. I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and giving of your time here tonight to ANJAC and our constituents. We appreciate all the research that you are doing and you will continue to do. And we hope that at some point we can bring you back and continue to learn from what you're learning, so that we can build an even safer situation for all of the marine beings that are out there, and continue to transition away from fossil fuels as we fight the climate crisis. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate it. Great. Take care. Bye-bye.